Vegas. That's a look at some of the events Book TV will be covering this week. Many of these events are open to the public. Look for them to air in the near future on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Hey, good evening. Thank you for coming. I am Carrie Robb. I'm the programming coordinator for St. Louis County Library, and I'm very pleased to present tonight's program with acclaimed sports historian Leigh Montville. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Maryville University, and our bookseller, Barnes & Noble. The team from the Chesterfield Barnes & Noble has the books for sale in the back of the room. Please do consider buying the book tonight. Purchasing the book helps support this author series and help us bring more great authors to St. Louis. Leigh will sign copies at this table after the talk. We just line you up by row and get it going very efficiently. So tonight's event is presented by the Buzz Westfall Favorite Author Series. This program was started in 2004 and presents authors of politics, history, and sports. You can visit the program for a list of the businesses and organizations that sponsor the Westfall series. Our next Westfall event will be next Tuesday, May 23rd. We're going to host our first fiction writer in the Westfall series when Jeff Shara will be here. He is a writer who writes sort of military histories. It's all history-based, but they're sort of novelizations of historical events. And this book is called The Frozen Hours and is about the Korean War. But on to tonight's program. Leigh Montville is a former columnist at the Boston Globe and a former senior writer for Sports Illustrated. He's written New York Times best-selling biographies of such iconic and fascinating sports figures as Babe Ruth, Ted Williams, Evel Knievel, and Dale Earnhardt. Tonight, he will share his new biography of one of the most celebrated and controversial athletes of the 20th century, Muhammad Ali, which is very appropriately titled Sting Like a Bee. Montville narrows his focus to a somewhat overlooked period of Ali's life, his struggle as a conscientious draft objector during the tumultuous Vietnam era, and the subsequent legal battle that took him all the way to the Supreme Court. Masterfully researched and told with great suspense, Sting Like a Bee is an inspiring account of the highs and lows of an exceptional individual and never fails to capture the charisma and complexity of Muhammad Ali. Please help me welcome Leigh Montville.
Thank you for that nice introduction. It's nice to be in St. Louis. I celebrated. I bought a new pair of pants for this from Nautica discount outlet. And the last time I bought a new pair of pants to come to one of these, I gave the whole talk, and I walked out and I saw, again, along the side of the pants, there was a long plastic thing that said 32 by 30, 32 by 30, 32 by 30. And so I was very careful in taking the pants and straightening things out. Muhammad Ali, this should be like the greatest book talk ever, the greatest book talk of all time, because we're talking about Muhammad Ali. You say that there's 1 million books on Muhammad Ali out there, and why should there be another book? And that's a very good question. Why is this guy writing this book? The last book I wrote was about Evel Knievel, and I finished that, and we were talking what I should do next with my publisher. And I think most writers want to do sort of that obscure story that nobody knows, sort of the Seabiscuit kind of thing, where America all of a sudden discovers this great story and falls in love with it. And so I proposed doing a book about a guy named Will McDonough, who was a writer at the Boston Globe when I was there. He had some mob connections and things like that and told great stories. And he was probably the most charismatic guy I knew. And my editor said, well, could you write out about a 25-page proposal on this? And I did. I wrote out the 25-page proposal. And he turned it down in about 5 seconds. And he said, you need to write about some iconic athlete. So I wrote a list of iconic athletes, and I wrote, I don't know, Johnny Unitas, Bill Russell, Walter Payton, and they all seem to have been done. There were all books on those guys. And then I put down Muhammad Ali, and I said, that's the most iconic guy of all. I mean, he's the most iconic athlete that's ever been in the United States, been in the world. And I said, maybe there's something in there. And the time period I came up with, the last big book on Muhammad Ali was written by the editor of The New Yorker, David Remnick, and it was written in 1997, and it covered the time in Ali's life from when he was born in Louisville till he won the world title and fought Sonny Liston, and it ended right there. And I said, well, what if I take the time period that went from there, and when he had the trouble with the draft board and the United States government, and kind of go with that. And I said that to my editor, and I gave him the proposed title, Muhammad Ali versus the United States of America. And he said, could you write me 2 paragraphs on that? And so I wrote the 2 paragraphs, and the next day he called up and said, we got a deal, we're going to do this. So that's how I'm doing it. And I found as I got into it, there were a couple of great reasons to be doing it. I'm 18 months younger than Muhammad Ali was. And so I was going through the same stuff with the draft and the Vietnam War in the 60s, and I got married around the same time as him, and his draft problems came up around the time my draft problems came up. And so that I really hooked in on that. The Vietnam War kind of changed a lot of lives. Just about everybody, I'd say my age, kind of was affected somehow. I mean, I knew guys that got married to stay out of the draft. I knew guys who started careers in education when they had no reason to be in education, and they've been in education all their lives because of the draft, because you get a deferment. I myself, I would have gone, I graduated from the University of Connecticut. I would have gone to Paris or somewhere like that and kind of bummed around for a while, but you really couldn't do that. So I went to 15 different National Guard outfits and, said, gee, I'd love to go there. And I found some outfit that actually needed somebody. And I wound up in Fort Jackson. And the first time I flew on an airplane was from Fort Jackson to St. Louis to go to Fort Leonard Wood. And we hitchhiked once to St. Louis from Fort Leonard Wood. We stayed in some kid's room at Washington University. And then we went to hitchhike back, and we got stranded in Rolla, Missouri. We stood by the exit there for 6 hours waiting for somebody to pick us up. And finally a guy came. He had a truck that only had, that the third gear was stripped. And he kind of chugged over and he picked us up and he took us home. And I had promised to God that I would from that moment on, that I would always pick up every hitchhiker that I saw. But I kind of broke that promise, I think, and I'm sorry, God. So the draft affected everyone, and Muhammad Ali, when the first thing that happened with Muhammad Ali was in 1964, right when he was fighting Sonny Liston. He was called up to go for his draft physical at the age of 18. And he went for the physical and the mental test, and he flunked the mental test. He really couldn't read very well and couldn't write very well. And math was probably, he was dyslexic, I think. And so he flunked the mental test, and then he flunked it again. And he had a score of like 16 on the test. And that was underneath the barrier. Plus then he got married, so he was out in 2 different things. He was 4F and he was married. Well, then he fought Sonny Liston a second time, and he got divorced. He had joined the Nation of Islam, and he got divorced because his wife wouldn't conform to the Nation of Islam. She wouldn't dress like that and wouldn't follow the religion. And so he now was eligible that way, and Vietnam was just chewing up people, and so they dropped the test. And so now his 16 passed the test instead of flunked the test. And he was called in to be in the service. And he was called he was changed to 1A. And that happened That happened in 1966. And I'll kind of read you what he said when that happened. When he said, you can edit out this part where he looks for the thing in the book. When he was reclassified 1A, and the reporters all stood around outside, he had gone into training to fight. He was going to fight Ernie Terrell in Chicago, and he was in Miami Beach when he found out. And he came out in front of this house where he was living, and reporters put on the cameras and stuff. And he said this. He said, "I can't understand how they can do this to me. Why be anxious to take me, a man who pays the salary of at least 200,000 men a year? 200,000 men, you hear? I can't understand, out of all the baseball players, all the football players, all the basketball players, why seek out me, who's the world's only heavyweight champion? Why are they so anxious to pay me $80 a month? Me, who in two fights pays for 6 new jet planes. I'm fighting for the government every day. I'm laying my life on the line for the government every day. 9 out of 10 soldiers would not want to be in my place in the ring. It's too dangerous. For 2 years, the Army told everybody I was a nut and I was ashamed. And now they decide I'm a wise man. They embarrassed my parents. Everybody was asking them questions, asking them if I was a nut. Even my ex-wife was ashamed. Yeah, it bothered me a bit. Now, without ever testing me to see if I'm wiser or worser than before, they decide I can go in the Army." So he said all that stuff and more. And the next day, he gave the quote that became famous or infamous around the country was, I don't have any quarrel with those Viet Cong. And that kind of seemed to be, at the time, you know, when the war was just kind of picking up, it almost seemed seditious, you know, that he was like allying himself with the enemy. And his popularity kind of just went down in a minute. And the fight with Ernie Terrell was canceled in Chicago, and a whole bunch of stuff. He took a big public relations hit. And the reason he objected to the war was because he was a member of the Nation of Islam. That was his total reason. He was a true believer in the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam was sort of an offshoot of Islam with a different kind of theology on the side of the white devils and oppressing the black man and just a different theology. And the idea was, why should a black man fight in the white man's war? The Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was the head of the Nation of Islam, he had served 4 years in jail during World War II, and a bunch of members of the religion had served time in jail for not going to Korea. And Muhammad Ali was in that line in his religious thinking. And so he applied for conscientious objector status, which entailed a bunch of things. He had a lawyer named Edward Jacko, who had been a big lawyer for Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam up in Harlem. He was called Jacko the Giant Killer because he had beaten the government on a bunch of things. And they filed a thing for conscientious objector. And as part of that, he had to go see a special judge. They brought in a retired judge. This was part of the apparatus for applying as a conscientious objector. They brought in a retired judge to talk, to decide whether or not he should be a conscientious objector. And this was Ali's one time that he could really state his case. And the guy here was 65 years old. His name was Lawrence Grauman. And he was in Louisville, Kentucky, and he wasn't known as a big civil rights guy at all. You know, he was kind of a country club guy in Louisville, and you wouldn't think Ali would have much of a chance. And he had a new lawyer now, a guy named Hayden Covington, who'd been a defender of the Jehovah's Witnesses for a long time. And Hayden Covington had been the most successful lawyer ever to appeal cases to the U.S. Supreme Court. He had gotten a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses out of serving in the Army, and there'd been a lot of cases about Jehovah's Witnesses refusing to say the Pledge of Allegiance and stand and salute the flag and things like that. So they went before this Judge Grauman. Ali stated his case. The FBI presented a file, and Judge Grauman went off to decide on this. And after about 3 weeks, Judge Grauman decided that Ali should be a conscientious objector. And he filed his thing with the Justice Department, and it was a non-binding decision. And the Justice Department said, well, that's very nice what Judge Grauman said, but we think you, Draft Board 47, really should consider Muhammad Ali 1A, and he should be drafted. So the Justice Department overrode what he said, what Judge Grauman said, and away we went for this whole thing, where eventually Ali was called for induction into the Army in Houston, and he refused to step forward, and that caused him to, every state, that started with the New York Athletic Commission, every state kind of rescinded his heavyweight championship and took it away. And the Justice Department had his passport suspended, so he couldn't go anywhere else in the world to fight. So he was out of a job. And a 3.5-year period started then. He got married again to a 17-year-old girl, Belinda Boyd, who was a member of the Nation of Islam, had grown up in the Nation of Islam school, and her parents were friends with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and she probably knew more about the religion than anybody. And the two of them kind of went off to figure out life. And he was making no money. He had spent all his money. And he wound up doing these college campus things where he went around to colleges and presented his case to the college kids. And he wasn't part of the draft board apparatus, the great protests of going against the draft. He was protesting mostly for himself. He wasn't with the kids that were burning their draft cards. He wasn't with the Berrigan brothers and the priests who were going in and pouring cow's blood on the draft records and all of that stuff. He was off kind of protesting on his own route. And he wasn't a civil rights guy either. He was the Nation of Islam belief was separation, not integration. And he once said if he could vote, he would have voted for George Wallace. That he wanted a segregated society where the black man would have, they'd give him a state or something, or a couple states, and it would be almost a separate country. And so he in fact, he would call the people that were marching under the Reverend Martin Luther King. He would say, "What are you doing? This isn't a thing you should be doing. If people don't want you, you shouldn't be trying to force yourself upon them." He said we should go off in a different direction. So he had a very different viewpoint than he had later in life, I think. And he was very controversial. And the funny thing happened is he was doing all these college dates, and a couple of years went by. 1968 came along where everything went crazy. That was maybe the craziest year going, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. There was that convention with Mayor Daley in Chicago. There were riots in 110 cities in America. Just a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, a guy tried to assassinate Andy Warhol. Stuff was just going on everywhere. And Muhammad Ali just didn't seem that controversial anymore. And as the war had ground along, more and more kids had convinced their parents that maybe this wasn't the greatest war in the world for them to be involved in, and had kind of rebelled against the thing. And slowly but surely, the national perception of Muhammad Ali had become much different. And when he finally got to the end of '68 and '69, there's a great thing. He was on firing line with William F. Buckley. I don't know if anybody remembers that show. You know, William F. Buckley was the erudite guy with the big words and the whole thing. And he was arguing with Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali was very good against him. I mean, he'd gone off and perfected his rap, you know, and in all these college things and arguing with college kids. And he was very good in that show. And different things along those lines. He showed up on more and more on Johnny Carson and Merv Griffin and the Mike Douglas show, and he became more mainstream. He appeared in a play on Broadway, and slowly but surely, the idea came that maybe he should be back fighting. And a guy in New York, a young civil rights lawyer named Michael Meltzner, he had kind of filed a whole thing in New York to get his license back, because he said Ali was really, you know, he really hadn't been convicted of anything. He was still in the appeals process. How could he lose his job for something that he hadn't been convicted for? That wasn't an American kind of thing. And so that had gone on, and another guy had tried to get him a license in Atlanta, Georgia, where in Georgia it wasn't the state boxing commission that licensed fights, it was the city boxing commission. So under the nose of Lester Maddox, probably the most segregationist governor in America, they pushed through the thing in Atlanta, and he signed to fight Jerry Quarry as his comeback fight. And he fought Jerry Quarry in 1970, and then New York thing had opened up, and he fought Oscar. He beat Jerry Quarry in 3 rounds, cut him up pretty bad, and they stopped the fight. And then he fought Oscar Bonavena in Madison Square Garden, and that fight went the distance, 12 rounds, and he won the decision. And then he signed to fight Joe Frazier, the fight that had been building and building and building. Frazier had become the champion in absentia, and Ali considered himself to be the people's champion. And it got built up, and it was probably the biggest sports event in 20th century America. You know, it was just huge. Each fighter got $5 million, which was an unbelievable amount of money at that time. And Jack Kent Cooke, who was the owner of the Washington Redskins and whatever, he was the one that put up the $10 million. And they fought, and Ali, for some reason, this fight of his life, this comeback fight of his life, really didn't train that hard for it. He wound up spending most of his training time talking to reporters and hanging around and doing stuff. In the meantime, Frazier was grinding away and grinding away and grinding away. And Ali's wife told him, she said, "You're going to lose to this guy. I don't even want to sit in the good seats. I'm going to sit way in the bad seats because you're going to." And sure enough, Frazier just ground away, and in the 14th round knocked Ali down, and Frazier won the fight. He won a decision. And about 2 months later, the case finally came before the Supreme Court. It had gone to the Supreme Court once, and the Supreme Court had refused to rule on it, which would have sent Ali to jail. But a second thing came up about wiretapping, and the FBI had wiretapped some conversations of Muhammad Ali, just 5 of them, without his knowledge. And so that brought him back for another chance to go through the courts and go to the Supreme Court. And it reached the Supreme Court, And the Supreme Court decided Judge Thurgood Marshall recused himself because he had been part of the Justice Department prosecuting Ali way back when all this started, before he became a Supreme Court justice. So it was eight judges were voting, and the vote was 5-3 that Ali was convicted, and he was going to go away. He was going to go away for 5 years after the Joe Frazier fight. And then Judge John Harlan was given the job of writing up this majority opinion that Muhammad Ali was going to go away. And he, of course, assigned his interns, his law clerks, to write the opinion. And the law clerks really they were part of the young people who had, changed the mind about Muhammad Ali. And they figured out a way to convince John Harlan that Muhammad Ali really should have got a deferment, as a conscientious objector way back there in the beginning, when the Justice Department had turned over what Lawrence Grauman, the judge had ruled. So John Harlan, to his credit, kind of believed the clerks, and he went back to the Supreme Court and he said, I changed my vote. So now it's 4-4, and it's a tie, and Muhammad Ali still would go to jail with a tie. But one of the other justices, Porter Stewart, said, what kind of decision is that? People in America will look at this famous guy, this famous case, and say, oh my God, the court can't make up his mind and he still has to go to jail. So they set about kind of looking for a way to get him out of to change the vote and to get him off the hook. And they found some wording in the Justice Department's decision on Lawrence Grauman's thing that kind of seemed contradictory. So they all voted 8-0, and Ali was off the hook, and he was off into the world. And that's the whole time period that's covered in the book. It kind of ends right there. And as we know, there was a whole bunch of his life that was lived afterwards. I had problems figuring out what the introduction was to this book. I was doing it for a couple of years, and I tried out a few introductions, and I couldn't do it. And then Ali died, and there was such an outpouring of emotion. It was like Gandhi had died, or Mother Teresa had died, and the funeral was shown live on television, and Billy Crystal and all these people were talking, and it was all great stuff, but it kind of, you didn't see where the edge was, what was going on at the time, where the friction was, what was happening. And I said, well, that's what my book is, showing what the edge was and what the friction was. Ali, at the end of his career, he became sick, and he just, for the last half of his life, was more of an inspirational figure than anything. And he did some wonderful stuff. And I think a lot of qualities were assigned to him that he had in the second half of his life that maybe he didn't have in the first half, when he was a much more controversial guy. And he's a fascinating guy, and I think he'll forever be the most interesting athlete and iconic guy that we've ever seen. Anybody want to ask some questions about...
I have a microphone for the questions. So it's on
about
TV.
Muhammad Ali or
Yep.
Evel Knievel or anybody else that I've written books about.
How were the funds provided for his defense all the years that he was not boxing and just lecturing?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. The Jehovah's Witness lawyer, Hayden Covington, he quit because they were stiffing him for the money, and that's why he wound up doing it. And a civil rights attorney from Atlanta named Charles Morgan, he'd been involved in a whole bunch of civil rights things there since the Birmingham March and the bombing of the church in Birmingham. He became involved, and then at the end, the Legal Defense Fund, which helped in civil rights cases, kind of did it pro bono. And and Charles Morgan did it pro bono, and the guy who did the work in the New York to get his license back in New York, he did that pro bono. He was a legal defense fund guy too.
Can you address the rumors that have persisted about Ali not stepping forward to be sworn in because he feared for his life under the threat of perhaps being killed by members of the Nation of Islam if he went and was drafted?
There's one thing in a book about Sugar Ray Robinson. Sugar Ray Robinson talked about Ali coming to see him at the Lowe's Midtown Motor Inn the night before he was going to fight Zora Foley, and saying that he was terrified and everything. But he truly, I don't buy it. I think he truly believed in the Nation of Islam and was very strong in the Nation of Islam. And for sure, there were some tough guys in the Nation of Islam. I mean, they did kill Malcolm X, and they did some things to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar also. But I think he was just a true believer. I really do. He went to when he got the Olympic gold medal. He was backed by this group in Louisville of 11 white businessmen, and they hired Angelo Dundee to be his trainer, and they sent him down to Miami, Florida, and it was all good. Angelo was a great trainer, but Angelo went home at 5 o'clock every night, and here was this 18-year-old kid down there trying to figure out and make connections in life and meet people and do things, and that's when he fell enthralled with the Nation of Islam. It really became his life, so I don't think he was afraid.
You never talked to him, never.
Well, I covered his last fight. I covered 5 fights of his, but they were after this time period. But no, for the book, no, he was kind of out of it.
And so, talk about the direct research and who. I mean, you had a lot of newspaper accounts and things, but what about direct interviews and things? Who'd you talk to?
I talked a lot with his wife at the time, Belinda Boyd. Her name now is Khalila Camacho Ali, and she had a good point. She said that Ali always the narrative. Ali controlled the narrative to his life better than anybody controlled the narrative, because people would just listen to Ali, and he would give them so many great quotes. They'd never go talk to anybody, and they'd never hear anything else from anybody else. And she was very interested, and she was kind of tough on him because their life ended badly with his womanizing. And there's a famous scene where the Thriller in Manila. She was home with the kids in Chicago, and he was with Veronica Porsche, who was his girlfriend, and they went to see Imelda Marcos or Ferdinand Marcos, and he said, your wife is just a beautiful woman. And Ali said, thank you very much. And Belinda saw this in Chicago, and she went right to the airport and got on a plane and flew right to Manila and came to the hotel room and raised a huge ruckus, and then turned around and came and got back on the same plane that she had flown. They were refueling the plane, and she came back to the Chicago, and that was kind of the end of their marriage. So she had interesting things to say.
Other questions? Oh, I got you.
Sure.
Did he remain with the Nation of Islam the rest of his life?
No, not so. The Nation of Islam, once the Honorable Elijah Muhammad passed away, his son changed the Nation of Islam over to like a Sunni Muslim kind of part of Islam, and Ali went with that. And the Reverend Louis Farrakhan, about 3 or 4 years later, reinstituted the Nation of Islam and when he broke with Elijah Muhammad's son. So no, he became just for lack of better words, a normal Muslim for the rest of his life, which was what happened with Malcolm X. That's where Malcolm X got in trouble with the Nation of Islam, because he had become a regular Muslim and not a member of the Nation of Islam. Yes, sir.
Was Howard Cosell and Ali always friends, that they maintained their friendship, that you could see when they would be interviewing you, when he would be interviewed by Cosell?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were friends, but I think it was a business relationship too. You know, I mean, I think they both got a lot out of it from each of their perspectives. You know, Howard afforded him a stage to work on, and he afforded Howard a stage to work on. I think they were friendly, but I don't think they went out to dinner a lot. Ali was walking out of one of his court dates with one of his lawyers, and he said to a reporter, he said, "I don't have any white friends." And the reporter said, "Well, right here, your lawyer is a white man. Is he your friend?" And he said, "He's my lawyer. He's not my friend." You know, so I think they were friendly, but I don't. They didn't go over to each other's house all the time. Yes, sir.
I was just curious, the ABC studio, that fight between him and Frazier, was that legitimate?
You never knew with him, you know. Early on, when he came back from the Olympics, he thought the streets were going to be paved with gold, and he would just start to fight, and it'd be sellouts, and people would go crazy. But he had to fight a whole bunch of people that most sports fans didn't know about to kind of build up a record, and he wasn't getting crowds at all. And what he did, he met Gorgeous George, who was the wrestler, and Gorgeous George's whole thing was, "Aren't I pretty? Aren't I good looking?" And he had blonde peroxide hair. He threw out bobby pins, and he had a valet that would spray perfume on him and things like that. And Gorgeous George would just pack these arenas, and people would go crazy. And Ali looked at it and he said, "Well, that's how you do it. You know, if you're a villain, you get people to come out." And he kind of added that to his act, and that was what he did with Sonny Liston and the bear. "I'm going to beat the bear," and he made himself into a villain, but which was all well and good. But then when the draft thing came up, he became the villain plus, because he had said these things that most of America didn't like at the time, And you wonder if Ali were around today in his prime, what would it be like, And I say, if you look at Colin Kaepernick, and you say, people had a lot of problems with Colin Kaepernick, they would have had 10 times the problems with Muhammad Ali. Colin Kaepernick wasn't doing anything. He just wouldn't stand for the national anthem. He was just protesting. And so he would be a very controversial guy today in the situation. Yes, sir.
Did you in your research discover, was he ever reimbursed financially for his loss of employment during that time after his case was ruled upon favorably? And then a two-part one. And then was there any other precedent set with this for any other conscientious objector cases that followed, or maybe his case set a precedent for?
The answers are no and no. The first no is, in a way, though, he was reimbursed in that everything was so big when he came back. If he hadn't gone away for the 3 years, would he and Frazier have gotten $5 million apiece to fight each other? You know, that's what made that whole thing, him coming from the desert, you know, and Frazier being here and just colliding, you know. It was, I remember watching that fight. I live in Boston, and I went to this, there was a nightclub, Caesar's Monticello out in Framingham, Massachusetts, and the whole place, I took my wife, and she was young, and we were there, and it was 9 million guys, and they were all half drunk, and the whole place went crazy, and Tiny Tim had walked in, and everybody, Tiny Tim, and it was just a crazy time. That was you know, Frank Sinatra took pictures for Life magazine, you know, stuff that and what was it? Oh, and there were no precedents, you know. If Muhammad Ali were just another guy, he kind of got celebrity justice in the first part, you know, singled out because of things he had said, and so he was kind of singled out and classified 1A and eligible for the draft. But at the end, he got saved with celebrity justice because, you know, his reputation was such. So it's an odd thing, the way it all went. And if he had been another guy, he would have been, you know, either in the service or in Leavenworth, I think. You know, he had legal, he had lawyers to back him up.
Any more questions? All right,
Yes,
I'll
sir.
come over with the microphone so it's on the recording.
I remember his later years and how weak he looked from, I guess, Parkinson's disease. Did he ever
Yeah.
talk about that and how boxing had affected the rest of his life?
Well, I mean, you know, it's an easy pop medicine kind of thing to say that boxing is what happened. You know, I mean, the rope-a-dope and all that, where he was just letting people pound on him, and the cumulative effects of all the things. You know, the moment where he lit the torch in 1996 in Atlanta was a huge iconic moment. You know, Janet Evans gives him the torch, and he you know, and I think America watched it with a whole bunch of different emotions going on, you know, and part of it I think is guilt, you know, that you got so much enjoyment from this guy, and he was so interesting with all the way he talked and the way he acted and the thoughts he made you think, and you kind of led him to this in a way because you cheered him on as a boxer and stuff. So I think there was some guilt and some definite devotion. You know, he certainly while he wasn't part of the anti-war movement per se, and he wasn't part of the civil rights movement per se, he certainly got a lot of people talking about that stuff, and people kind of used him as a model for action, you know, to stand up to the government, to kind of go for your rights. You know, in the end, that's what his image was.
In your research, did you ever come across anything on Joe Frazier being in the service or having served in the service?
No, Joe Frazier had a lot of kids real early, you know, and that kind of kept him out. But he was always very patriotic, you know, like 5 or 6 days after the fight in 1971, where he beat Ali the one time, he was in the White House with Nixon. And Ali said that, before the fight, Ali said that. He said, Joe Frazier will be there with Nixon. He said, Nixon won't have anything to do with me. And that was part of Ali's rap about the whole thing.
I was at the airport here many years ago, and a flight from Atlanta came in, and guess who came off the plane? And we locked eyes just very briefly, and without even thinking about it, my hand went out to him, and he put his hand out to me. We shook hands. I thought, I just met the most famous guy I'll probably ever meet. He was very friendly. He wasn't put offish or anything like that. He had
a great curiosity about people, I think, you know, and I think that that overrode a whole lot of stuff. He was very pleasant and very glib. My big memory of the first fight I covered him was in when he fought Chuck Wepner. There's a movie just came out about Chuck Wepner, and I was young, and I went, and it was at Richfield, Ohio, right outside Cleveland, and it was 45 minutes from Cleveland. So I rented a car. I was there for the Boston Globe, and I rented a car, and so I drove out to the weigh-in the day before the fight, and I didn't know that the media mostly got on a bus and went out, and then they got taken back on a bus. So I drove out in the car, and after the weigh-in, everybody got on the bus, but I was still there. And I said, well, maybe I should go to Muhammad Ali's dressing room and check it out. Maybe I could get something different. And so I went, and I went in, and there was no security, nothing. And I went in, and there were maybe, 7 or 8 people in there, and he was stretched out on a rubbing table, and his back was kind of up against the wall. And Billy Eckstein, the singer, that old Black Magic, James Brown, the singer, Papa Got a Brand New Bag, he was there, and Red Fox was there. And Red Fox was telling dirty jokes. And Red Fox is from St. Louis, I guess. And Red Fox, he was telling the best dirty jokes I've ever heard in my life. And he would tell, and everybody's sides were just splitting, and tears were in their eyes. And we'd all be and Ali would say, tell another one. And Red Fox would tell another one that was even more dirty and even better than the last one. And it was like a moment, I just, in that moment, I kept saying, I wish this could go on forever. Maybe James Brown will start singing. Maybe somebody else will come in and the whole thing. But I kind of peeled out of there, I was this little howdy-doody guy standing there. And I kind of peeled out of there, and I went over to Chuck Wepner's dressing room, and Chuck and his wife were there, and they were all by themselves. And we talked, and it was nice. And there's the famous quote from Chuck Wepner before the fight. He bought his wife a flimsy negligee, and he said, I want you to wear this tonight when you go to bed with the heavyweight champion of the world. So he goes and he fights, and he puts up a credible thing. They base Rocky on Chuck Wepner's fight against Muhammad Ali. But he gets cut up, and he goes to the hospital and stitched up, and it's 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. He gets back, and his wife is sitting there, and she's got the negligee on, and she says, well, is he coming down here, or am I going to go to his room?
I was interested in your comment, paraphrase it. Ali was the most iconic athlete of, I guess, U.S. history, I think you said. And you've written about Ruth and Ted Williams and a number of others. So quickly, who else do you list as iconic? And are there any quick answers, response why Ali's number one? And then aside of that, what were your impressions, and did you respect Evil?
Okay, one. Let me think. Ali was global. I mean, that's the difference, Babe Ruth was semi-global, but Ali was global, and everybody knew Ali. He was probably one of the, 4 most known people in the world when he was going on, right up there with presidents. And so he was the biggest. Iconic, I don't know. I mean, we all know all those people, the famous athletes, I suppose iconic is touched to your age too. If you say Johnny Unitas, maybe that says you're a certain age, or if you say, Walter Payton or Jim Brown, But I mean, all those people are iconic in their own respects. And Evel Knievel was a bad guy. He, there's a lot of talk about narcissism today. He was a narcissistic guy with big hair. So I don't know, how you want to relate that to our present situation.
You want to take one or two more?
Yeah. Anybody else?
I was just curious to know if Layla Ali is the daughter of Belinda Boyd or someone else.
No, Layla was later. Layla was later after with Veronica Porsche, and he had some children too that weren't with any of his wives. He did a lot to propagate the future of America.
All right, is there one more question, or should we sign some books? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was nice, very good.
Okay, again, the book is for sale in the back of the room from Barnes & Noble, and Leigh will be right here at this table, and we'll get you guys some books.
Book TV recently visited Capitol